Hi everyone! So lately I've played a lot of Rogue, including Twisting Blades. And a lot of people ask me with the nerfs in Season 3 to a Blade Dancer and Close Quarters Combat, what should I do now on Twisting Blades? How does the setup work? Because the damage feels low, of course, it got a pretty heavy nerf, and it's kind of like a ranged Rogue season. A lot of people are playing Pen-RF or Barrage or something with the precision buffs, but melee Rogue is still a thing. So Twisting Blades is probably one of the fan favorite builds, and I decided I want to try to optimize it again. I've already done some tweaks to the build before the season launched because of some of the changes they've made with the close quarters combat nerfs and also the new aspect resistant assailants, which I think is really good on many rogue builds, including this one. If you don't know which one I'm talking about, this is the new defensive aspect that allows you to reset your concealment cooldown when you kill an enemy, in particular an elite. And if you invest into cooldown reduction and concealment ranks, usually one elite kill is actually enough to pretty much bring back your entire concealment. So you can see this here. And this allows you to reset your shadow imbuement with the Night Stalker glyph. So this is a pretty common combo. I've already put that in a build before the season launched because I immediately knew this is gonna pump. And well, it works like a charm. So it's not that easy to actually make Twisting Blades do enough damage, but with this you have a lot of AoE damage, and then it's just all about figuring out a single target damage. So what I've done here, as you can see here, I went back to like some very old school setup with Cold Imbuement and Penitent Greaves. So Penitent Greaves have basically not been played at all last season, at least. Tibbot's Will is too strong, etc. And we didn't really need to invest into stuff like Penitent. But it does feel like a bit low on damage if you don't, and Penitent Greaves has some pretty big advantages here. Number one is you can like have easy proc of the control glyph, for example, which otherwise you would only really do when you like slow with puncture or something like that, or you spread a slow from a glove like a hit roll. So this helps a lot to just like get the slow glyph, control glyph up, get a chill effect, and of course Frigid Finesse. So like this, I was actually able to beef up the damage enough to feel pretty decent again. And because you're running Cold Imbuement, it also helps us to actually freeze enemies. This build invests quite a bit into imbuments. For example, there's the corruption aspect, so that you get bigger shadow pops and you get the bigger non-physical damage increase. And then there's also the Cold Imbuement. And Cold Imbuement synergizes pretty well with Twisting Blades. Usually it's kind of difficult to find a right place for Cold Imbuement. A lot of people don't really play with it. A lot of builds don't really play with it. But I felt in this setup in particular, it was a really good match. So usually you have like a problem to solve, like either you need AoE damage, then you have Shadow, either you need single target damage, and you have Poison. Well, and there's not that many other problems to solve most of the time, but Cold Imbuement in this case fits really well, just to give you an extra boost and also make the build safer, because there are not that many like powerful defensive aspects that you still have space for in the setup. But Cold Imbuement with the CC and then Twisting Blades with the Daze, it does help a lot to actually stay alive as well, and gives you a nice burst against elites. So whenever you're fighting single target elites or even the bosses, you can include this Cold Imbuement. You can freeze them immediately, you get a bigger Frigid Finesse multiplier. The hit itself will do more damage because Cold Imbuement has this effect here with up to like 20% extra and then even 40% extra against frozen enemies. And this gets scaled as well by, for example, the corruption. So you have like one really big burst, you can do like double damage or so when you freeze them with this, and then you can move on and just explode everything with Shadow Imbuement. So the build feels really fun. It's pretty fast still. It's definitely one of the top speed farming builds for like easy content. However, it's not that easy to make it work for the high tiers and for the bosses anymore. For that, I run with the Poison Imbuement, so just as a little sneak peek here right now. For Pinnacle bosses, for example, we do have the full poison combo here. There is Pestilent Points, there's Bursting Venoms. So this is still what you're playing there. And also for T100 NMD dungeons, we are playing Poison. And if you are used to like the Poison TB Rogue from the past, that one has been heavily nerfed, like more than the regular Twisting Blades, because they also bug fix a bunch of stuff with Twisting Blades and Poison Imbuement. So this will feel like the biggest loss here. However, it's still the way to do most damage on this build. So the setup has not really changed, it just got much weaker, probably something like 70% or a bit more than that. So it's not that easy to just produce poison ticks that do like dozens of millions of damage or so, but you can probably get there if you really try, and you can still melt bosses relatively well, all the way up to T100s. But it just requires a bit more investment, a bit better setup, and then it will work. However, for the standard variant and for the leveling version of Twisting Blades, I feel like this setup works really well with the Cold and Shadow combo, and you can fly through this easy content, you can fly through those maps, you can level pretty fast, and it's relatively competitive for that purpose. So it's still like a top-notch speed farming build, I think, because you can just, hit and run, everything explodes around you, you reset your shadow movement all the time, and it feels really cool. I already talked about some of the combos here, like the quality movement and the corruption, but let's go over the skill tree. So here's the puncture, this is our standard generator, gives us combo points, we run this with combo points. You don't really have to play around the combo points all the time. However, you should usually do at least one attack before you do your right click, because this has a chance to proc condemnation, which is kind of nice if it happens. And also we have tricks of the trade here. So whenever you use a marksman skill, you get 25% damage for your next cutthroat skill. So usually you want to do at least a 1-to-1 rotation to at least proc this. And whenever there's like, bigger targets and you know that they're not gonna necessarily pop in like one hit, then you usually want to go for 3-to-1 rotation. But this depends a bit on the situation and like how hard is the content that you're doing. But yeah, this is our basic attack here. Then we have Twisting Blades, so we run the Daze upgrade. It just gives us lots of extra survivability and allows us synergy here with concussive, extra crit. We get trick attacks, we get rapid gambits, we reduce our evade cooldown a lot, because this build runs Penitent Greaves and it doesn't have an evade mod like charges or attacks reduce cooldown, but you can still do it with this. Then that's really nice. And also we have the Juggernaut aspect. So Juggernaut this season really good and gives you like all the armor you need, but you have a longer evade cooldown, which just doesn't really feel so bad when you have rapid gambits. You just run around, attack a few things, you get it back immediately. So that's really nice. And also with Penitent Greaves, whenever you're not fighting in town or just, on the way to the next pack or something, you can just do an evade and you get this capped movement speed basically very easily. And then you start attacking, you reset it and repeat. So it has a really good synergy there and a good flow. Then we have the Shadow Step here. This is kind of important because it procs Unstoppable. At least in a late game, you're going to have Tybalt's Will. So this is another really strong damage multiplier. I was actually not running this in the footage that I was showing there, so I didn't have it really ready for this. But it is really powerful. It gives you a bit of defense, lots of resources, lots of damage. So we proc this with Shadow Step, which has a built-in Unstoppable, and you can do this every few seconds. And also with Concealment, this also has Unstoppable. So you have this up pretty much all the time, and you refill your resources very easily with this. So this is a nice advantage. So whenever you're just like flying through maps, you barely have to do any punctures, and instead you can just do like Twisting Blade, Twisting Blade, Twisting Blade, Shadow Step, Twisting Blade, and so on. And it just refills your energy, so it's really cool. Then about the Concealment, we have the Vulnerable upgrade here, because we do have the Exploit Glyph, so this makes everything vulnerable for 3 seconds, but it is not really enough sometimes, and then you have this here. You can also go for the Guaranteed Crit. It's kind of up to you, depending on, if you have sometimes longer fights, but I felt the Vulnerable is a bit better. You want to have enemies vulnerable also, for example, for the Corruption aspect. It's a nice damage bonus in general. So there you go. And because we don't run the vulnerable explosions here from Shadow Imbuement. So I talked about Shadow Imbuement and the non-physical damage. This just increases all of your damage that you do pretty much, because a lot of it is imbued, either Shadow or Cold. So this is really nice and also works with the Corruption. And early on, before you have Exploit Glyph, for example, you can run Blended Imbuement. I actually have that in a leveling setup here, for example. So you do this. You also have, for example, Consuming Shadow if you really struggle with resources in the early game. But as you get more and more of the setup going, and as you have the Exploit Glyph and you have a low Concealment cooldown, you will have Vulnerable up, and then you can do this basically. Here's the Cold Imbuement, so it sometimes makes enemies vulnerable as well. And we have this extra damage against crowd-controlled enemies. So this includes any crowd control, even if you puncture them and then slow them, for example. The Daze from the Twisting Blades, anything works. So this does not work on bosses. However, you can stagger bosses with this setup extremely fast, because we have the slow, we have the Daze, we have the freeze and the chill. and bosses stagger in like 10 seconds or something in dungeons. So if you ever do dungeons instead of vaults, for example, the idea is you stagger bosses really fast, and then you have a cold imbuement ready for the time when the stagger bar fills, and then you pop it and you do like a massive nuke against them, because then this modifier actually works when the boss is staggered. And you also have Frigid Finesse, so you get another 30% bonus there, and you can kind of like melt the bosses. So the idea is that you farm at it here, where you can do bosses in something like 20 seconds or so with one stagger. So this is kind of what you're shooting for. However, if you go to like higher tiers, that doesn't really work so well anymore, because bosses just get tanky, and this setup doesn't have that much raw damage output. So it kind of relies on this stagger combo to do like, you know, one nice burst, and you don't want to go too high with this. But it definitely works to farm dungeons with like up to +10 levels. So this is the maximum you have to farm by leveling up at least. And again, if you want to do like T100s or close to that, there is the poison variant later. So I'm going to go over that later. And finally, down here is a few passives, and we have the close quarters combat. Now, for the remaining setup here on the gear, so I've already shown some of these aspects. So Juggernaut, very important, resistant assailant. This gives you the concealment resets. So usually the way you want to play this is that you activate Shadow Imbuement pretty much whenever it's ready, and try to not waste a charge on the Shadow Step. Shadow Step can be imbued and you have only 2 charges. So usually try to, for example, Shadow Step somewhere to next target, get the speed buff, and either it's like a big pack and then you activate imbuement immediately, or it's not, then maybe you try to Shadow Step to the next, or you just activate Shadow Imbuement anyway and carry it to the next pack. And whenever you activate Shadow Imbuement, you also activate Concealment if it's ready, to immediately proc this cooldown reduction. So you want to always make sure that you activate Shadow Imbuement first, and then like this you have like a very short cycle of Shadow Imbuement, Concealment, Shadow Imbuement, Concealment, etc. So the exact rotation depends exactly on the enemies you're fighting, because this only procs when you defeat elites. But this also works with champion monsters, for example. So keep an eye out for your Concealment cooldown, and after a little while you get the muscle memory down. And if you actually manage to get a bit of cooldown reduction on your helm and your amulet, this starts feeling really good. Here's also the expectant aspect. This is just extra damage when you use combo points. So as I said, usually do at least like 1 attack, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. So this just stacks up more damage. We have the Blade Dancer on the 2-handed. Blade Dancer is actually somewhat powerful now. It gives you up to 60% of the return damage as a spinning rotation damage. So the spin, if both of them hit, actually deals more damage than the return itself. This was effectively buffed a little bit, especially for non-poison builds. That's really nice and helps out with the build a lot. We have Accelerating here, more attack speed. We have Edge Masters, more damage. We have Icy Alchemist. This gives you also more cold synergies. So whenever you activate Shadow Imbuement, you can now also proc Frigid Finesse, for example. You can freeze stuff even when there's like a big pack, and you get more damage out of this. So the explosions themselves don't do that much damage, but this Icy Alchemist just procs a lot with this build because of the spinning blades. You get a lot of lucky hits, and you have the cold synergies without even using cold imbuement. So this is really great. For the stats on your gear, you try to cap your resists. So you get already 1 from the Penitent Griefs. If you don't have them yet, you can just run other boots with more resists, and then figure it out later once you get them. Then we have also here resistances, cooldown, Shadow Imbuement ranks, just bigger pops, lots of defenses on the chest. Your glove should look like this. You want the Twisting Blades rank, and then crit, attack speed, and chance to slow, or lucky hit, but usually chance to slow is better, because it can proc the control glyph, for example, before you get Penitent Griefs. It can proc more stagger, and also it can proc, for example, the Wiles Paragon node here. So it's just like a nice amount of damage reduction, as you can see. So this is the main reason to have this. We have Tibor's Will. Before that, you just use like any random pants. You can use like a Might aspect or something like that, just for like extra defense. So you can do that early on, but later you won't really need that. You want more damage, and you get the resources back. So you want to get those. Then on your weapons, you want to have close damage, main stat, all stat, and crowd control enemies damage. So we do crowd control a lot. This doesn't work on bosses, but it works on pretty much everything else, and it's pretty much always up. And it scales our close quarters combat. So this has been nerfed. Now you can expect something like 30 to maybe up to 40% damage increase, but that is still sizable. So we still roll damage to crowd controlled enemies here on these weapons. Same story here. Here's a Condemnation. So I talked about this. It's just nice. You don't have to run Condemnation. You can also run, for example, Ashiras if you want to go faster. It has a bunch of attack speed and move speed. Kind of nice. or just a normal weapon, put like an elements aspect, for example. So there are some options here, but the combination is probably the best option. And for the rings, you want to have resource and crit, most importantly, and then life, and then any kind of damage like vulnerable, close damage, or something like that. Probably the best option here. And the amulet, you want movement speed, energy cost reduction, cooldown reduction, and then like any of the damage passives. There's like exploit, malice, weapon mastery, this kind of stuff. And the good part is that with this setup, you're going to end up with your resistances capped because, well, you just need like 2 resistance rolls here, you get 1 there, and we have the rest here from the gems, for example. So make sure you have 70% everywhere. And you also have your armor capped against pretty much every enemy in the game. So this actually has overkill armor, this setup with the Juggernaut. It's just so powerful. And you could, for example, even remove like this armor roll here on the chest, maybe get a life roll or something like that, or put like a resistance here and then something else here, for example. The planner already has like 8k armor, and this does not include the Juggernaut aspect. It's currently not calculated into this value. So like this, you're going to end up with like easy 12, 13, 14k armor, which is enough for everything in the game. Now let's talk about the Paragons a little bit. Most importantly, the Night Stalker glyph, when I get that early, you can actually activate the Night Stalker glyph at level 1 on the starting board. So as soon as you get it, you're going to slot it on the starting board, and you have the combo pretty much online, because at least in Season 3, Resistant Assailants is also in the codex. So you want to try to get a good roll, of course, but the setup starts working pretty early. You can see this here actually when we go to the leveling version. So here are all the steps. So you start here, you put the Night Stalker immediately, and then we add the cheap shot board. This has all of this like damage to crowd control, scale, close quarters combat. We have the slow, we have some DR. There's the cheap shot node, which is pretty strong for this as well. Then we have the tricks of the trade. We put the closer here at the start, but this will change later. And we're gonna put another glyph there. So there are some glyph slots once you level them all up. So be aware that in the last step, I have the leveled up glyphs, and this is the final setup. But we get a tricks of the trade node. I talked about it. You want to do a puncture, you get tricks of the trade. It's really nice. Then we add no witnesses. It's just stats basically. Then we add the Lyrana's Instinct. This is where you want to put the control glyph. This is the strongest glyph in the setup because of this damage to crowd controlled enemies. So first you get a lot of additive damage, and then you also scale the close quarters combat here, and you have by far the most int here on this board. Later you have 49 int. There's also nimble, lots of attack speed there, feels kind of good. And then there's Eldritch Bounty. So you can also choose to do a bit of a respec and do Eldritch Bounty much earlier. For example, if you want to do that, when you level up, you can just go here and basically just attach Eldritch Bounty right away, and then keep going with this path on the left. Eldritch Bounty is a relatively powerful node, but it does not really make much sense in the final setup to have it like very early, because you don't have many rare nodes here, and you rather try to like buff more rare nodes on other boards here. So yeah, I have this at the end, but you could do a respec at level 100, for example, and then put this last, and at the start put it earlier. However, it does not necessarily matter too much. Yeah, and finally, here's the final step. So this is the exact setup once you have all the glyphs leveled. So you swap them around a little bit. Closer goes on the starting board, Night Stalker goes on this board, Exploit goes here. It's just a bit more optimized with like the stats that you have on each of the boards. You have the turf there for close damage and damage reduction, and then control. So this is the final board. And like this, you have a really nice overall setup. For your robot, there are a few options here. This is the one I made. So we have Flash over Adrenaline, and this gives us extra buffs. And we have longer duration, shorter cooldown, Fortify, you can get a bit more damage reduction. And I have the Tempest here that gives us efficiency for the crit, slow for the damage reduction from the Paragon, so that we proc it a bit more frequently, and Safeguard for damage reduction as well. So this is just kind of like the all-rounder setup that I made here. You can play around with this. You can go Reconstruct for the heals. You can maybe get like something else in there. And of course, if you have the unique stones, you want to slot them in as well. So for example, instead of Fortify or instead of Slow or Safeguard. So there are some options there. Now let's talk about the poison setups. They are quite different from what you have seen. But what I just described, this was like the general setup. This is the one that you see me play here in those clips. This is pretty much what I had here. And my setup was not really optimized. I had just respected this, played it for a few hours, tried to like min-max it. And I was still lacking like, you know, really optimized gear. And this can definitely go way up to at least 70s, 80s or so, at least in vaults when you don't have to defeat bosses. This setup works pretty well and is really fast. And you can decimate those elites even all the way up to like the 925 loot tiers basically, and farm a lot of these stones, farm a lot of gear in the vaults. Now if you want to go all the way to like T100 dungeons, I do suggest to actually switch the setup, and it's quite different here. So this is like the typical full poison combo. You run poison imbuement, we run bursting venoms. So whenever this thing procs, you have this poison puddle under you. You can stand in it. You have infinite poison imbuements. Then we have stuff like pestilent points to proc that bursting venoms more often. And in general, the whole theme is a bit different. So there's no more cold, no more shadow. You don't have these shadow pops. So this is like a more slow-paced setup because you have to stack up the dots, but you have a lot more damage output overall. However, as I mentioned, this is also the most heavily nerfed, and also T100 dungeons are not necessarily like the target right now because the loot kind of caps out at 90. Even a bit earlier, like 85 or so, is totally fine, and you can kind of do that with the other setup, especially now that you don't have to defeat bosses. So I'm just going to go over this real quick. And we have, well, what I mentioned with the poison combo, we also have the X-Files ring. So this one gives you like these poison explosions every time you do like a poison imbued twisting blade that can proc. And these explosions are pretty powerful. They can go up to like 1 million or more and kind of just like pop all of the trash monsters around you and even do pretty decent chunks on elites. So this is kind of like the setup here. And then, yeah, some other tweaks, like there is more damage reduction in there. And we don't have the penetrant grease anymore. Instead of we have shared misery, just to make the fight safer, spread the daze everywhere and these kind of things. There's a smoke grenade in there, gives you extra damage and also more daze. So there are some tweaks here, and this is how the setup plays. The Paragon is also a bit different and also has a bit different glyphs. Most importantly, the tracker glyph for poison. This is really powerful for poison builds. And also we have the efficacy glyph here, so even more poison damage. And also gives you more damage reduction with the rare buffing and so on. And this looks a bit different here, as you can see. So this is rearranged, but plus minus kind of like the same synergies that they're trying to build anyway. And the same boards they're using. There's tricks of the trade, no witnesses, etc. And this also looks kind of similar for pinnacle bosses, so I'm also going to go on that real quick. So the Paragon board here is also similar. We also have a very similar setup with bursting venoms yet again. And we have lots of attack speed, and here we also have pestilent points to proc bursting venoms, and we also have the energizing aspect. So when you fight bosses for a while, you might run out of resources when you have really high attack speed. For example, there's also Shiras, so you have like really fast attacks. And well, we use energizing just to stay up on our resources. Now, if you have a really good setup, you have like energy cost reduction and stuff, you can also just probably do it with innovation, depending on the exact boss fight you're doing. But I felt energizing just kind of feels good to make sure that you always have your resources up, and it also to, for example, do like really fast rotations, like 1-to-1 puncture twisting blades whenever you're bursting venom procs, and you just like attack really quickly and keep proccing bursting venoms, which is kind of the advantage here. And lastly, for Uber uniques, some of the most important ones you can use here are Harlequin Crest. So this just goes into basically any build, and including this one. And we also have the Ring of Starless Skies. So when you get this on, this is a huge benefit. It allows you to like spam your twisting blades a lot more, especially for farming content. So you have 40% damage, 40% damage resource cost reduction. Really powerful item. You can even slot in a Doombringer, but usually this is not needed, at least for farming content. You will already be more tanky anyway from stuff like the Shaco. But for like T100 dungeons, for example, Doombringer is definitely a pretty good advantage because it gives you tons of life. So in addition to those two here, you can also run a Doombringer. And for example, you place the Ashira's Kanjar there, which doesn't do all too much, and do get like, a huge damage bonus from these items anyway already. And this should feel really nice and smooth once you get this. But again, this is kind of optional. And you can also see exactly in the builds here, like for example, if you go down to the variants, there are the exact setups here with all of the uniques. If you're looking at any of those macro guides, by the way, you can also always just click here. It says click to open, and then it will open this planner. So like this, you can also look at the details there sometimes of what you're looking at. But we have everything here. These different setups are all explained. There's more details in this guide, so I recommend you to go check it out, especially if you haven't played Twisting Blades yet. And that also concludes this guide. So I hope you enjoyed this. I wish you good luck with the Rogue in Season 3. I have a bunch more stuff coming. I've played a lot of Rogue lately. I've played Penetrating Shot. I've played Barrage. I'm working on some really cool Death Trap stuff right now as well. Some of it including Twisting Blades. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to have more stuff to share. For now, this is it. So hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys next time.